Hi, and welcome to this presentation entitled Grief: An Introduction. My name is Cindy Rowe, and I'm an MSW student at Marywood University. And I'm first going to discuss some basic assumptions about grief that are supported in the academic literature, then take you through an overview of the main models of grief, and we'll wrap up with a discussion on some of the implications these models have on social work practice. To start off, it's important to make the definitions of some basic terms clear. The study of death and grief is known as thanatology. Grief, which is a process that involves specific reactions someone has to a loss, is often used interchangeably with the term mourning when they are used in the context of loss due to someone's death. And bereavement refers to the state of mourning in grief. A key assumption in thanatology is that grief is a universal experience. Everyone at one point in their life or another will experience the death of someone close to them. What is unique is the experience of grief itself. Each person might feel a wide range of emotions, such as fear, shock, dread, guilt, anxiety, anger, or sadness. These feelings can be felt and expressed in different intensities, but for the most part, they tend to be most intense early on in the grief process. Cultural norms influence a whole host of things regarding death and grief. Funeral customs and practices, for example, not only vary from culture to culture, but can also be very different among different families within the same culture. Similarly, how people experience and express grief varies from person to person. For more information on how different cultures approach death, you can always check out my other video by using the link that's posted here. Over time, different researchers and psychologists have conceptualized grief as occurring in stages, phases, or involving tasks. Stage models of grief break down grief into distinct stages, with the most well-known model being that developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. The idea of grief being understood as a series of tasks the bereft has to complete was first proposed by Freud, with other contemporary researchers such as Bowlby, Worden, and Rando also supporting this concept. The process perspective suggests that people's grief moves at different rates, ebbing and flowing between emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, such as in the dual process model, which we'll discuss in a little bit. The current consensus among thanatology scholars is, overall, they reject the idea that grief moves in phases or stages, instead widely favoring the idea that grief is a process that mourners go through, which involves various tasks. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed this stage model from her extensive work with people who are dying. This model implies that complete healing requires the person to work through each of these stages, which are shock and denial, anger, resentment, guilt, bargaining, depression, and adjustment or acceptance. Two major criticisms of this model are that her focus in its development was exclusively on the person who was dying, not paying any attention to the families of that person. Also, current research indicates that people don't move through the grief process in such a neat, orderly, linear way. So the concept of grief as progressing in stages has been rejected. Being the earliest to study aspects of psychology, Freud presented a model of grief which assumed that the bereft person must accomplish the work of grief in order to separate themselves from the deceased, so they can move on to form new relationships with other people. This involved internalization, which is the transformation of the bond with the deceased, and what's called hypercathexis, the highly painful thoughts, feelings, and memories of the person who died. Survivors must work through these aspects in order to reach the point of decathexis, where the bond between them and their loved one is broken. Once that bond was broken, the person could then move on to form new relationships with others. Freud believed that if a person didn't do this work, that their grieving would become much more difficult and complicated, and that this in turn would increase the likelihood that they would develop some sort of mental illness. Thus, according to his perspective, this grief work should be done as soon as possible. There are two main criticisms of Freud's theory. First of all, his work was based on Western culture, so it lacked cultural sensitivity. And secondly, he implied that engaging in the work would actually be a cure to the person's grief. Eric Lindemann expanded on Freud's work and believed grief was expressed through a cluster of symptoms, such as emotional distress, the preoccupation with thoughts about the deceased person, feelings of guilt and anger that could be expressed outwardly as hostility, and behavioral changes, all of which rendered the bereft person in a disabled state. Like Freud, Lindemann believed that the resolution of grief was tied to how well the person did their grief work. Thus, in his view, grieving has a specific time frame, and that effective treatment would take 4 to 6 weeks for about 10 sessions overall. According to him, longer time for recovery was seen as a problem. Parks also believed grief could be resolved quickly if a person did the work needed to process their feelings. He defined 2 aspects that influence bereavement. The stigma of death refers to the uncomfortableness others have regarding death. Offering condolences and supporting the bereft is kind of awkward sometimes because others are unsure about what to do or say that would really be helpful. So people might tend to avoid talking about the deceased person or offering any kind of support to the mourner. Secondly, being deprived of the love and feelings of security from the deceased person causes the grieving person to feel a great deal of sorrow. Today, researchers still debate whether a definitive amount of time for grieving exists, given the fact that each person experiences grief in their own way. However, recent evidence suggests that widows grieving the loss of their husbands report experiencing less emotional pain around 2 years after their husband's death. Unfortunately, many well-meaning relatives and friends may think a grieving person is taking too long to get back to normal. So the key takeaway here is that grief never really ends. Rather, the grieving person eventually is just able to cope more effectively with their loss. Bowlby's theory counters Freud's idea that the bonds between the deceased and their loved one have to be severed in order for the grieving person to be able to invest their energy in forming new relationships with other people. Instead, Bowlby suggested that the death of someone close disrupts the emotional security the relationship provided for the survivor. So, death causes them to feel separation anxiety, very similar to what an infant feels when they're separated from their mother. Because when their loved one dies, the bond the survivor has with the deceased doesn't just go away, it changes. Bowlby saw secure people as being able to express their despair and other emotions, in addition to being able to build new ideas about themselves and their loved one. Attachment to the deceased sometimes plays an important role in the survivor's sense of who they are. The roles of lover and caregiver, for example, can contribute to a person's identity because they have such a strong affiliation with the person's life partner. So when their spouse dies, these roles that the survivor had for such a long time just suddenly disappear, which can cause them to struggle with like a crisis of identity, as now they have to figure out, well, who am I now? Similarly, the bonds survivors have with others can also change, as in the case of bonds the survivor and their spouse form together. The friendships the couple have with other couples can soften a lot after the death of one's spouse, so much so that over time the widow or widower can eventually lose the friendship with that other couple. So, for example, let's say a couple, husband and wife couple, becomes friends with the husband's golf buddy and his wife, right? That friendship was formed in the context of the couples, with the husband being the stronger link in the overall friendship. So after the husband's death, if the two wives themselves don't form their own friendship bond, The closeness between the widow and these two friends is likely to weaken over time. So according to Worden, there are 4 tasks that need to be accomplished in order for the grief process to be complete. Accepting the reality of the loss can compel the grieving person to want to learn as much as they can about exactly what happened that led to their loved one's death. In addition to the search for meaning, the tasks involved with planning and attending the funeral serve the purpose of helping the grieving person and other family members and friends accept the finality of the death. The second task, that of processing the pain associated with the loss, is important for the healthy adaptation to life without the loved one. Some people might resist thoughts and memories of the deceased because they want to protect themselves from the pain associated with their loss. Modern society isn't always helpful to mourners in this area either, because of the social norms that suggest that expressing grief somehow means that the person is weak. Thus, well-meaning friends and family might tell the grieving person something like, "You're strong, you'll get through this, just keep being strong," which can subconsciously convey that the grieving person is just feeling sorry for themselves and they should just suck it up and move on. Sharing memories of the deceased can help support the grieving person. Funny stories of them, and funny memories in particular, can help break the hard tension the bereft might be feeling that is somehow never going to end. So using humor in those times can be really helpful. The third task, adjusting to life without their loved one, involves making external, internal, and spiritual adjustments. So external adjustments refer to the changes in the survivor's life regarding their everyday functioning, commonly coming to light around 3 to 4 months after their loss of their spouse, for example. A widower is faced with the realization that they now have to manage all the tasks of daily life by themselves, especially those that their dead spouse used to do. Internal adjustments refer to the changes to the sense of self that the grieving person endures. As described earlier, the bonds to their spouse may strongly influence the widow or widower's own sense of self. So the surviving spouse reconfigures their internal definition of who they are as an individual. Spiritual adjustments may also come into play, as the death can challenge the basic assumptions of life that are embedded in the worldview of the bereft. The grieving person might question their religious beliefs, such as the benevolence and compassion of God, and wonder what they might have done to deserve to have their loved one taken away from them. Lastly, the grieving person must build a new life that includes memories of the deceased. The work of the practitioner thus involves helping the client define where memories of their lost loved one belong in their overall psyche. So by keeping these memories in proper context, they won't inhibit the client's personal development. Therese Rando developed an acronym of the tasks of mourning. Similar to the other concepts we've looked at so far in some respects, this model states that grieving involves recognizing the loss of a loved one, reacting to it, remembering the person who died, relinquishing or letting go of their attachments to the deceased, readjusting to the life without their loved one, and then reinvesting their energy into forming new relationships with others. A key assumption of the dual process model, which posits that people kind of oscillate back and forth between tasks and stressors related to the loss of the person who died and those related to moving on and building a new life, is that one style of coping will affect their overall ability to adapt to their loss. So this continually shifting focus between these two aspects basically helps the mourner build up their coping skills. So for impacts on social work practice, social workers need to be aware that everybody grieves in their own way. So there's no right or wrong way to grieve. They also need to be mindful of the fact that these individual differences are influenced by a person's cultural, societal, and family-based norms, and their stage of development, as these all impact the grieving process. That being said, though, they should also work from the strengths perspective and be mindful that most people are resilient and clients always have the potential to experience personal growth, no matter what they're going through. However, they should also be aware of the signs of complicated mourning in order to recognize when a client could be at risk for that as well. Social workers also need to be aware of the past loss of clients, as how they have been grieved, and if their past losses have even been effectively dealt with. These both can have a big influence on a wide range of issues a client might be struggling with. It's not always apparent to the client that issues from their past can be related to their current problems, so the reasons they state for seeking treatment can be very different from the true antecedents to their problems. Also, grief, particularly unresolved grief, can be reignited in a person's life over time, reappearing at key points in their life, such as new losses due to death, or the time of year when they lost a loved one, or when the client reaches the same age as the person who died. Lastly, practitioners should continually enhance their own competence by educating themselves about the current research on death and grieving, because new knowledge is continually being developed and presented on a regular basis. So just with any other topics within social work, it's always really important for practitioners to continually educating themselves. So this concludes this presentation, and if you're interested in learning more about death and grief in the context of social work, visit my YouTube channel by following the other links here, and where you can see presentations on other topics. So thanks again for watching.